It was another sunny day at Greenfield Elementary School. The schoolyard was full of life, with children running, laughing, and enjoying the playground equipment. The sound of laughter echoed, creating a joyful and carefree atmosphere. However, not everyone shared in this lightheartedness. In the farthest corner of the yard, a group of boys had formed a tight circle around Luke, a shy, black boy. Luke was new to the school. With his short hair and quiet, attentive demeanor, he stood out for his discretion. But that afternoon, he couldn't hide. Mark, the leader of the group, stood in the center of the circle, mocking Luke, who appeared to shrink more and more. "Look at this," shouted Mark, with a malicious grin on his face. "Why don't you say anything, Luke? What are you scared of?" The other boys laughed, though some seemed hesitant. Mark's jokes were harsh and cruel, revolving around Luke's appearance, his clothes, and especially his skin color. "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" Mark continued, now lightly pushing Luke by the shoulders. Luke hunched over even more, not responding. His eyes glistened with sadness and shame. He clutched his backpack tightly, as if it were his only shield at that moment. Watching from a distance, Sophie, an 8-year-old girl with light brown hair and curious eyes, saw the scene and felt a knot in her stomach. She wasn't close friends with Luke, but she knew enough about him to see that he was quiet and always polite. Sophie felt torn. Should she do something? Intervene? Fear paralyzed her. Mark was one of the most popular boys at school, and confronting him seemed frightening. Time seemed to slow down as Sophie watched the scene unfold. Mark's insults continued, growing crueler with each word, and she felt that something had to be done. Even though her inner voice told her to stay quiet, Sophie knew, deep down, that what was happening was wrong. She took a deep breath, clenched her fists, and started walking toward the group. Sophie slowly approached the group, feeling her heart racing. Each step felt heavier than the last, and for a brief moment, she considered turning back. Mark's cold stare intimidated her, and the boys' laughter echoed in her mind. But when she saw Luke's face, hunched over and helpless, something inside her changed. He was alone, and Sophie knew she couldn't let that continue. "Hey!" she shouted, with more strength than she had imagined. Mark and the other boys turned, surprised. The group fell silent, the laughter abruptly stopping. Sophie stood firmly in front of Luke, her small body resolute. She looked directly at Mark, without breaking eye contact. "What do you think you're doing?" she said, her voice shaky but firm. Mark raised his eyebrows, visibly surprised that someone had the courage to challenge him, especially Sophie, a small and usually quiet girl. "I'm just messing with him. What's the problem?" Mark replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "This isn't messing around," Sophie shot back. "You're being cruel, and he didn't do anything to deserve this." Mark let out a cynical laugh, crossing his arms. "And what are you going to do, Sophie? Are you going to defend him?" he said, taunting her. For a moment, Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. The weight of being the center of attention in the group was overwhelming. But as she looked at Luke, whose eyes were now filled with tears, she knew she couldn't back down. She turned to him and extended her hand. "Come on, Luke, let's get out of here," she said, her voice softer now. Luke hesitated for a moment, but seeing the determination on Sophie's face, he took her hand. The gesture, so simple yet full of meaning, caused his expression to shift from sadness to a mixture of relief and gratitude. Mark watched the scene with a sneer, but it was clear he didn't know how to react. The other boys, who had been laughing along with him, now looked uncomfortable, exchanging nervous glances. "Go on, run off with him," Mark taunted, trying to regain control of the situation. "But you'll regret it." Ignoring the threats, Sophie gave Luke's hand a gentle tug, and the two began to walk away from the group. As they distanced themselves, she could feel the tension dissipating, but Mark's words still echoed in her mind. Luke didn't say anything as they walked, but his eyes said enough. He looked at Sophie with a look of relief, as if she had lifted an immense weight off his shoulders. Sophie smiled shyly at him, feeling proud for doing the right thing, even though her heart was still pounding with nerves. As they walked away, Sophie felt a wave of relief, but she knew it wasn't over. She had stood up to Mark, and that could have consequences. However, at that moment, all that mattered was that Luke was no longer alone. She had made a difference, even if it was a small gesture. "Thank you," Luke murmured, his voice barely audible but full of sincerity. Sophie just smiled, feeling the warmth of Luke's gratitude filling the space around them. The path back to the schoolyard seemed lighter now, and she knew she had done the right thing, even if fear still lingered. That school day felt longer than usual for Sophie. After the incident with Mark, the classes went on as normal, but her mind kept returning to that moment in the yard, over and over again. She hadn't told anyone what happened, and Luke remained quiet, avoiding the glances of the other classmates. Even so, Sophie felt that something important had changed, at least for her. When the final bell rang, releasing the children to go home, Sophie felt a slight tension in her shoulders. She knew she still had to tell her father about what had happened. Sophie always shared what she experienced at school with her father, Richard, a gentle man, with a serious expression, but a heart full of love and care for his daughter. He always encouraged her to be brave, to do what was right, but also to be cautious of the consequences of her actions. When she got home, Sophie found Richard sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper. He greeted her with a soft smile, as he did every day. "How was school today, Soph?" he asked, folding the newspaper and placing it on the table. Sophie hesitated for a moment, grabbing her snack before sitting down at the table with him. She knew she should tell him, but for some reason, the words seemed hard to find. After a brief silence, she sighed and began to speak. "I did something today," Sophie said, her voice calm but unsure. Richard raised an eyebrow, interested but waiting patiently. "What did you do, sweetheart?" Sophie then told him everything. The situation with Luke, Mark's bullying, and how she decided to intervene. Her voice wavered at times, especially when she mentioned Mark's threats, but she went through with the story to the end. When she finished, she looked at her father, waiting for his reaction. Richard remained silent for a moment, absorbing what he had just heard. He was a thoughtful man, and he always chose his words carefully, especially when it came to something involving his daughter. His eyes reflected a mixture of pride and concern. "You were very brave, Sophie," he finally said, his voice calm but firm. "It's not easy to confront someone, especially when the situation is unjust. I'm very proud of you for standing up for Luke." Sophie felt a wave of relief hearing that, but she knew there was more on her father's mind. He wasn't the kind of person to see the world in simple terms. He understood the complexities of actions and their consequences. But he continued with a soft sigh, "You also need to understand that not everyone reacts well when they're confronted, especially when they're in the wrong. Mark might try to retaliate, or he could make Luke's life even harder. Are you prepared for that?" Those words made Sophie think. She knew she had done the right thing, but the weight of the possible consequences hadn't really crossed her mind until now. She looked at her father, who was now watching her with kind but serious eyes. "I know it can be difficult," Richard said gently, "but sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean everything will be resolved easily. What you did today was important, but you need to be aware that this might mean both you and Luke will face challenges." Sophie reflected on her father's words. She hadn't considered that her actions could lead to further conflicts, but now that he mentioned it, it seemed obvious. Still, in her heart, she knew that, regardless of the consequences, she couldn't let Luke suffer alone. He needed someone to support him, and she was willing to be that person. "I understand, Dad," she finally said. "I know it could be difficult, but I don't think I could let it happen again, even if it's scary." Richard smiled, satisfied with the maturity he saw in his daughter. He stood up from the table, walked over to her, and hugged her. "I knew you would be strong," he whispered lovingly. And I'm with you always. What you did today was much bigger than you realize. The hug warmed Sophie's heart. She knew she had her father's support, which gave her even more strength to face whatever was to come. What she didn't know, however, was that that small act of courage in the schoolyard would have much bigger repercussions than she could have imagined. The days that followed were relatively calm for Sophie and Luke. Although Sophie still felt a slight tension when walking through the school hallways, she noticed that Mark and his group kept their distance. Luke, on the other hand, seemed more relaxed, despite still being a reserved boy. Sophie didn't regret her decision, but she sometimes felt the weight of her father's words echoing in her mind. You must be aware that this could mean you and Luke will face challenges. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Sophie's house was quiet. The sun filtered through the living room curtains, and Richard was in the kitchen preparing a snack while Sophie was drawing on the couch. Everything seemed normal until suddenly, the sound of knocks on the door echoed through the house. Sophie stopped drawing and looked at the door, her father doing the same from the kitchen. Unexpected visits were not common, especially at that time. Richard dried his hands on a kitchen towel and walked to the door, glancing quickly through the side window before opening it. When he opened the door, Richard found a man standing outside, well-dressed, with a serious and reserved expression. Sophie, curious, peeked from the living room, trying to figure out who the visitor could be. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, with a polite but cautious expression. The man took a deep breath before speaking, as if preparing for an important conversation. "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Michael. I'm Luke's father." His voice was firm, but there was a slight tone of emotion in it. Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised, but kept his polite tone. "Of course. Luke, my daughter Sophie's classmate," he replied, briefly glancing at Sophie, who was now standing, watching the conversation. Michael nodded, and then looked directly at Sophie, who hesitantly approached. "Yes," he said, with a small smile of gratitude. "That's why I'm here. I wanted to thank Sophie personally for what she did for my son." Sophie's heart began to race. She hadn't expected something like this to happen. Luke's father was at her house because of what she had done at school. Richard, noticing the surprise on his daughter's face, invited Michael to come in. "Please come in. Make yourself comfortable," Richard said, making space for the visitor. Michael entered the house and settled on the sofa. The atmosphere was a little tense, as if there was more to come beyond a simple thank you. Michael held an envelope in his hand, and Sophie noticed that he seemed hesitant, as if trying to find the right words. Michael began looking at Sophie. "Luke told me what happened that day, about how you stood up for him against Mark and his friends. I don't know if you realize how much that meant to him. My son was going through a very tough time, and what you did wasn't just a help for that day. It was something much bigger." Sophie sat down next to her father, feeling a bit uncomfortable with all the attention, but at the same time touched by Michael's words. Richard also remained silent, listening carefully to every word. "What you may not know, Sophie," Michael continued, now with a slightly trembling voice, "is that Luke was recently diagnosed with a serious health issue. He has a heart condition, and it's been very hard for him, both emotionally and physically. On the day you defended him, Luke was feeling lost. He didn't tell me directly, but I know he was carrying much more than just the weight of the bullying." Silence filled the room. Michael's words hung in the air, leaving a sense of gravity that Sophie hadn't anticipated. She looked at her father, who seemed to absorb the information seriously, his eyes now full of empathy. "I truly believe that what you did for Luke that day helped more than you can imagine," Michael said, looking directly at Sophie. "You gave him strength, and that made all the difference." Michael then opened the envelope he was holding and took out a letter. He handed it to Richard, who read it silently. Sophie, not fully understanding, watched as her father's expression became more serious as he read. "I didn't know about this," Richard murmured, clearly surprised. Sophie looked at her father, trying to understand what was happening. "What is it, Dad?" Richard took a deep breath before answering. This letter is from the doctors who are treating Luke. They mention that his emotional state has a direct impact on his heart condition. And Michael believes that your actions, Sophie, significantly improved his emotional well-being. Sophie's heart was pounding. She had never imagined that her decision to defend Luke could have such deep repercussions. What had seemed like just a gesture of friendship now turned out to be something that had touched Luke's life in a much more profound way. Michael looked at Sophie with tear-filled eyes. "Thank you, Sophie. You saved my son in more ways than one." The silence in the room was palpable. Sophie, still processing what she had just heard, felt a mix of surprise and responsibility. She knew that standing up for Luke was the right thing to do, but she had never imagined that her gesture could have such deep consequences for his emotional and physical health. The revelation that Luke was dealing with a serious heart condition added greater weight to the moment. Richard looked at Michael, still holding the letter in his hands. He seemed to be processing the words, absorbing the impact of the situation. "I didn't know Luke's condition was so serious," Richard said, breaking the silence, his voice calm but filled with empathy. "I'm so sorry to hear that he has been going through all this. As a father, I can imagine how hard this must have been for you too." Michael nodded, his eyes tired but grateful for Richard's understanding. "It's been a very difficult time for us," Michael said, taking a deep breath. "When Luke started facing the bullying, everything became even heavier for him. He shut himself off. He didn't want to talk about school or how he was feeling. It was like he was carrying an invisible burden, and knowing that his own body was vulnerable made him even more withdrawn. I could see it in his eyes, but he didn't want to tell me." Sophie looked at Michael, her eyes full of empathy. Now, she understood even more the importance of what she had done. Standing up for Luke hadn't just been an act of courage in that moment, but also a chance to rescue someone who was deeply hurt. "On the day you stood up for him, Sophie," Michael continued, his voice now firmer, "something changed. When Luke came home, he was different. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. He told me what happened, how you got him out of that situation, and it was the first time I saw hope in him again. That was something I hadn't seen in months." Michael's words touched Sophie deeply. She smiled, though her heart was racing with the new sense of responsibility she now felt. "I just didn't want to see him suffer anymore," Sophie said softly. "He seemed so alone. No one should feel that way." Richard placed his hand on Sophie's shoulder, a gesture of support and pride. He knew his daughter had a kind heart, but now he realized that her kindness had made a much bigger difference than he could have imagined. "Sophie, what you did was more than just standing up for Luke against a bully," Michael said, now leaning forward slightly, looking directly at her. "You gave him a reason to believe that things can get better. Luke's doctor told me that his emotional state was crucial to the treatment he was receiving. Luke's improvement in the past few days has been remarkable, and I believe it all started with your act of kindness." Michael paused and pulled something from his coat pocket. It was a small photo of Luke younger, with a wide smile on his face, from a time before he faced the difficulties he was now going through. He handed the photo to Sophie. "This is Luke as he was before all of this," Michael said, his voice slightly choked with emotion. "And you helped bring that smile back. I will never be able to thank you enough." Sophie held the photo gently, looking at the boy who, for so long, had seemed to disappear behind a mask of sadness and fear. She felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The simple fact that her gesture had made such a significant difference was both overwhelming and deeply gratifying. Michael smiled, though there were tears in his eyes. He looked at Richard, then turned back to Sophie. "But there's something else you need to know," he said, changing his tone, which heightened the tension in the air. Richard and Sophie exchanged curious glances, unsure of what to expect. "What you did didn't just save Luke emotionally. You gave him the strength he needed to move forward, but it also revealed something important about our past, something that I myself only discovered recently." Sophie frowned, confused. Michael seemed to hesitate, as if trying to find the right words. "What I'm about to tell you is something that completely changed my view of what happened between our families, and in a way about myself as well. He adjusted himself on the sofa, holding the envelope again, as if he were about to open a new door of revelations. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as Michael continued speaking. Sophie and Richard watched him closely while he held the envelope, still unopened, as if it contained something that would completely change the way they saw this story. When Luke started having health problems, Michael said, with a more serious tone, I began researching more about our family's medical history. I wanted to understand where this might have come from, if there was something in our past that I didn't know. But what I found was much more than medical issues. I ended up discovering something about our past that shocked me. Michael paused, looking at Richard. I found out that, decades ago, my grandfather worked for your wife's family, Richard. The company they had at the time was one of the largest employers in the city. Richard frowned. The information seemed unexpected, but he said nothing. Sophie watched the scene, curious and confused, trying to piece things together. My grandfather was a very hard-working man, but he faced prejudice and discrimination the entire time he worked at that company. Michael continued, now with a note of bitterness in his voice. He ended up being fired under racist circumstances. For years, he struggled to support our family after that. It destroyed his spirit, and the impact of that reverberated through generations. Sophie looked at her father, seeing that he was trying to process that revelation. Richard took a deep breath before responding. I never knew about this, Richard said, his voice low and thoughtful. Her family never mentioned this story. Michael nodded. That's not something people talk about openly. But over the years, that event created a rift between our families, even if not everyone was aware of it. It was something unspoken, but it was there, present in our past. Sophie, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. But what does that have to do with what happened at school? She asked, feeling like there was still a connection missing. Michael smiled softly, his eyes now reflecting a mixture of sadness and hope. Everything, Sophie, because without knowing it, you helped heal a wound that had been open for decades. By standing up for Luke, you broke a cycle of pain and discrimination that started many years ago. What your heart led you to do that day was more than just a simple act of kindness. You gave our family something we couldn't find on our own, a chance for reconciliation. Sophie felt a shiver run down her spine. She had never imagined that her action could be connected to something so deep and old. The fact that their families had been divided by an injustice in the past, and that now, somehow, she had begun to tie those loose ends together, left her speechless. Richard, in turn, seemed lost in thought. The revelation that their families' histories were so tragically intertwined touched him deeply. He remembered his wife's words, how she always talked about wanting to create a better future for Sophie, free of the prejudices of the past. And now there was his daughter, helping to fulfill that dream. I really don't know what to say, Richard murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But I do know that my daughter is a special person. Sophie has always had a big heart, and seeing her do this, even without knowing the whole story, makes me incredibly proud. Michael nodded, also moved. I feel that somehow fate brought us to this point, and it all started with what your daughter did for Luke. Silence fell over the room once again, but this time, it was a silence of mutual understanding. Words were no longer necessary. The pieces were finally coming together, and the connection between the two families seemed to be healing. Sophie, still processing everything, looked at her father and at Michael, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of relief. Somehow, her simple act of compassion had changed the course of a story that had begun long before she was born. Thank you for telling me this, Sophie said finally, her voice soft but firm. I didn't know any of this, but I'm glad I was able to help in some way. Michael smiled at her. You did more than you realize, Sophie, and for that, I will be forever grateful. Richard stood up and extended his hand to Michael. I think our families have a lot to talk about from now on, but I thank you for sharing this story with us. Let's work together to make sure the future is different. Michael shook Richard's hand. and the two men exchanged a look of respect and understanding. The room, once filled with tension, now felt lighter. A new chapter was beginning, not just for Sophie and Luke, but for their families, who were finally finding a path to reconciliation. The room was calmer now, but the emotional tension still lingered in the air. Sophie felt that in some way, that meeting had redefined her actions at school. However, there was something more she sensed in her father's eyes. Richard seemed deep in thought, as if he were holding on to something that still needed to be revealed. Noticing the change in Richard's expression, Michael leaned slightly forward. "Richard, is there something else you'd like to share?" he asked, his tone gentle but full of curiosity. Richard took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. He looked at Sophie and Michael and finally decided it was the right moment to share something he had kept silent about for many years. "Yes, there's something I need to tell," Richard said with a heavy sigh. He paused as if searching for the right words. "I've never told Sophie this. In fact, I've never spoken to anyone about it, but I think now is the right time." Sophie frowned, confused but attentive. She had never seen her father look so serious, so reflective. "When I was a child, I also faced prejudice," Richard began, his voice slightly lower. "I grew up in a poor community where people were judged by what they had, by the color of their skin, or by their appearance. Although I wasn't directly a victim of racism, I suffered because of my economic status. That marked my childhood in a way that I still carry with me today." Sophie looked at her father in surprise. She had never heard about this before. To her, Richard had always been a strong and confident man, but now she saw that he too carried invisible scars from the past. "At school, I was often ridiculed for not having the newest clothes or for not having what others had," he continued. "And, like Luke, there were moments when I felt completely alone. There were days when it seemed like the whole world was against me." Michael and Sophie remained silent, allowing Richard to tell his story. "I remember one time when I was walking home after a difficult day at school," Richard said, his voice now full of emotion. "A group of boys cornered me, laughing at me, saying I would never amount to anything. I went home that day feeling like the world was a cruel and heartless place." Richard paused, looking at Sophie, his eyes now filled with unshed tears. "And it was in that moment, Sophie, that I promised myself that if I ever had children, I would do everything I could to make sure they never went through that. I wanted my children to grow up in a world where they were treated with respect, no matter who they were or where they came from. I wanted you especially to grow up knowing that true strength lies in standing up for others, in doing what is right, even when it's hard." Sophie sat in silence, her hands clasped in her lap, feeling the weight of her father's confession. It was as if, in that moment, she was meeting a new part of Richard, a part he had kept hidden for so long. "I never told you the story because I wanted you to believe the world could be a better place," he continued. "And seeing what you did for Luke, I realized that you not only believed that but also acted to make the world better. You are proof that the next generation can be different." Michael, clearly moved by the revelation, looked at Richard with empathy. "I'm so sorry for everything you went through, Richard," he said, his voice firm but sympathetic. "But you've raised an incredible daughter, and what she did for Luke is a testament to the man you've become." Richard nodded, visibly touched. He stood up and walked over to Sophie, kneeling before her. He took her hands firmly, looking into her eyes. "Sophie, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You did something I didn't have the courage to do when I was young. You stood up against injustice, even when you were scared. And because of that, you didn't just change Luke's life, you changed mine too." Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes as her father squeezed her hands. His words were a relief and an acknowledgement of everything she had been feeling over the past few days. "Dad, I just did what I felt was right," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Richard smiled, wiping away a single tear that had escaped his eyes. "And that is the greatest gift you could give me." The silence that followed was filled with emotion and understanding. Sophie and Michael's families were now connected by something much greater than the story of pain and prejudice. that had once divided them. Sophie's gesture had healed deep wounds, and now the two families had the chance to rebuild a new relationship based on respect and empathy. Michael, emotional, stood up to say goodbye. He looked at Sophie one last time, gratitude etched on his face. "Thank you once again, Sophie. You really made a difference in our lives." Sophie smiled at him, feeling that, finally, everything was starting to make sense. "I just did what I thought was right," she repeated humbly. Richard walked Michael to the door, while Sophie remained seated, absorbing everything that had happened. In that moment, she knew that, even though she had faced fear and uncertainty, her actions had triggered a change much greater than she could have ever imagined. A few weeks had passed since Michael's visit to Sophie and Richard's home. The atmosphere at school had noticeably changed. Mark and his group of friends, once so arrogant and cruel, seemed more distant and restrained. Sophie's intervention and the support Luke had received not only gave him a new sense of confidence, but also opened the eyes of other students to injustices that had previously been ignored. On that sunny Saturday, Sophie and Luke were at the park near the school. The sky was clear, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air as they ran around the playground equipment. Luke, with a wider smile than Sophie had ever seen on him, was running carefree, playing tag with a few other children. He finally seemed to be the happy child who, until recently, had been hiding behind a wall of sadness and fear. Sophie watched him from afar, sitting on a bench next to her father. The soft smile on her face showed a mix of relief and satisfaction. She knew that everything that had happened over the past few weeks had transformed Luke and, in a way, had also transformed her. "He seems so different now," Sophie commented, watching Luke as he played. Richard, sitting next to her, nodded, with a proud look in his eyes as he gazed at his daughter. "Yes, he does," Richard replied, his voice calm and reflective. "And you played a big part in that, sophomore." Sophie shrugged, as if unwilling to take the credit, but Richard placed his hand on her shoulder, gently making her acknowledge the reality of what she had done. "Don't shy away from this, Sophie," he said with a smile. "What you did was more than just an act of kindness. You helped change the course of his life, and maybe even the lives of others around him." Sophie thought about her father's words. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed by the idea that something so simple, taking a stand against bullying, could have such profound repercussions. But as she watched Luke laughing and having fun, she realized that her father's words were true. Luke's life had changed, and it gave her a sense of peace. Richard, ever the thoughtful man, looked out at the park with a pensive expression. "You know, Soph, for a long time I thought the world would never change, that the same prejudices and injustices I lived through would continue. But you've shown me that the world can be different. One person's actions can create a ripple of change. And you did that," he said, his eyes filled with emotion. Sophie smiled at her father, feeling the warmth of his words. She was still young, but she now understood that the choices we make, even the simplest ones, have the power to change the world around us. She had never thought she would see herself as someone capable of making such a difference, but there she was, reaping the rewards of her courage. As Luke ran towards them, still panting from all the playing, Sophie realized that it wasn't just his life that had changed. She had grown too. The experience of standing up for someone in need, facing her own fears, and learning about her family's past had made her stronger, more aware, and perhaps more prepared to face whatever lay ahead. "Hey, Sophie," Luke shouted, his face beaming with joy. "Come play with us." Sophie laughed, shaking her head. "I'll be right there, just give me a minute," she replied. Luke waved and ran back to play with the other children. Sophie looked at her father one last time, taking a deep breath. She knew that, no matter what the future held, she had the ability to make a difference. And with her father by her side, she knew she would never be alone. Richard stood up and held out his hand to Sophie. "Come on, let's join them. I think I can still run a little," he said with a smile, clearly challenging his own age. Sophie laughed and took her father's hand. "Let's see if you can keep up then," she replied, as the two of them joined the children. And so, under the bright sun of that day in the park, Sophie felt that a new chapter of her life was beginning. A chapter in which she fully understood the power of her actions, the impact of her kindness, and the responsibility to keep doing what was right, always. The future was full of possibilities, and Sophie was ready to face it with courage and an open heart.